Welcome, everyone, to our session on conversational intelligence and the science of building trust. This is a really important topic for a number of reasons. First of all, we have a lot of research that tells us that trust is not just something that makes us feel good, it's something that actually helps us to better collaborate, and it improves the quality of our thinking as well as our productivity. And with that in mind, one of the best tools that we have available to us in order to build trust is conversations. So today, I want to focus on three key areas. First, I want to talk about the neuroscience of trust. There are some really interesting studies that have been done over the past couple decades, and they're going to be very helpful for us in identifying how can you create trust, not just at that emotional level, but also at the neurochemical level as well. After that, we're going to talk about three specific actionable techniques that you can use in your conversations to dial up that trust dial to improve the quality of the conversation right on the spot. And finally, we're going to go a little bit deeper into the levels of conversation that we engage in and how those levels can have an impact on influence and persuasion. The goal is that by the end of our time together, you're going to have specific techniques and strategies that you can apply immediately to build trust, to improve the quality of your conversations, and to use as a tool for yourself, for your team, to be able to do better, more meaningful work. Sound good to everyone? Let's jump in. I want to start by asking you all a question to reflect on. I want you to think about a good conversation you had, one that really made you feel good. And maybe this happened today or yesterday. Maybe it's something that happened a while ago that you still remember. But I want you to think, why did it make you feel good? And if you'd like, feel free to add your answer into the chat or the Q&A box if the chat is not working. Why did that conversation feel good? Take a moment and reflect. Now, as you think about this, I'm going to ask the opposite question, which is to think about a conversation that did not feel good. And I'm going to ask you why. What about it felt bad? What about it made the feeling emotionally, or even sometimes at a physical level, a negative one? Okay, some really good answers coming through in the chat. So on the positive side, Anna, you felt truly listened to and heard. This is so important. Rob, I was able to persuade a business partner to move ahead with the project. I'm sure that felt really great. And then on the negative side, they were distracted. Someone was distracted, not paying attention, not caring. Yeah, when that happens in a conversation, that can have a really immediate impact on how we feel. And one of the really important things that we're going to look at today is that there is almost no conversation you're having that's neutral. You typically either feel good or not so good in a conversation, and therefore that conversation is either adding to the trust that you feel or detracting from it. It's a net positive or a net negative in every interaction. There's almost never any neutral. So with that in mind, I want to ask first the basic question of actually, what is trust? If you were to define it for yourself, how might you define what trust is? Because there's a lot of definitions that float out there, most of them very legitimate. But how might you define it? Think about it. And if you'd like, I welcome you to add your definition to the chat. What is trust? Okay, so I'm seeing know when someone cares. I know that the other person has my interest in mind. Okay, these are really good definitions. Anna, you can count on the person. This is great. So these are very solid and important definitions. And I'm going to add a different definition to our mix. And this one comes from Judith Glaser, who is the founder of the field of study now known as conversational intelligence, the science of trust through conversation. And so here is Judith Glaser's definition. Trust is a neurological process in the brain. So everything that you've pointed to so far, and And I see feeling safe, secure in a situation. Yes. And what's really important to keep in mind for our purposes is, in addition to that, there's actually something happening at a neurological level. So let's dive into some of that research. In 2010, Angelica DiMoca led a team of researchers who studied what is happening in the brain when we're engaged in conversations. And what they did was they had volunteers hooked up to an fMRI that was measuring brain activity. And first, they had them engage in conversations with a very high level of trust. And then they had them engage in other conversations where they felt a lot of distrust. After all of this was over, Angelica DiMoca and the team looked at the brain scans, and here is what they found. First of all, in conversations where trust was high, the part of the brain that was primarily lighting up was the prefrontal cortex, the executive brain. So this is the part of the brain that's responsible for rational thinking, but it's also responsible for creativity, for empathy, for judgment, for our strategic social skills, for innovation and risk-taking. In short, everything that you probably want activated when you're in a conversation with someone. Then they looked at what was happening in the brain during those conversations where there was a lack of trust. And here's what they found. The part that was lighting up was the amygdala. This is the part of the primal brain that is responsible for our fight or flight response. So all humans and mammals have this response in order to protect us. When we sense danger, we are filled with neurochemicals and hormones that get our muscles and our bodies ready to either fight or to flee. The problem, however, is that this is our primal brain. It is not as sophisticated as our prefrontal cortex. And so it has this response not knowing the difference between a saber-toothed tiger that's about to attack us versus when our manager comes up to us with a weird look on their face and says, "We need to talk." Now, I was once having this conversation with a pretty senior leader at a financial services company. And at this point in the conversation, he says, wait. So all of this is really interesting. It makes a lot of sense, but here's the issue. The conversations that myself and my team are having 99% of the time are not emotional ones. We're not talking about performance reviews. We are talking about data. We're talking through logic, numbers. We're purely rational, and therefore we are just operating within the prefrontal cortex. Now, do we think this is an accurate assessment? First of all, no. What we know is that even if the data that we're discussing is completely logical and rational, that doesn't mean that we and our brains are not having emotional responses to the speakers, to the way that someone said something. But I want to add another nuance to this part of the conversation, another way to look at this. And for that, I want to give you a scenario, and I'm going to show you a video. So imagine the following scenario. Let's say that you have been assigned to look for a new software that's going to help to make your team more productive. You're the one in charge on your team for finding this. Now, you've started having some conversations, you've done some research, and you've narrowed it down to a couple companies. In a moment, you are going to have a conversation with a salesperson that you met once. So you're talking for the second time. And they seem like they might have a promising product. You're not fully sold yet, but you want to know what's coming, what they have to offer. And so let's imagine that the following conversation happens. And I'm going to ask how you're feeling about it.
Hey, great to see you again. Feels like we're practically teammates at this point, right? How you been? Good. Now listen, I've already been mentioning your name in my other sales calls because I just know you're going to move forward with us. And look, I know you said you're in charge of managing the evaluation, but I took the liberty of looping in your boss, forwarding him the notes from our meeting. Figured it'd save you a little time, right? Managing up, you know? I'm sure they'll appreciate the heads up. Anyway, look, big news. I ran the numbers again last night, and we are going to increase your output by 28.4% minimum. That's 9.2% higher than our closest competitor. And honestly, they're inflating their benchmark, so it's probably more like 12%. Oh, you're going to love this. If we close before the end of the quarter, I can get you a 30% discount. Actually, 33% if you're willing to do it just like a little short testimonial, just a paragraph, nothing big. And you would be great. great on camera. Okay, so let's kick off today's meeting, right? You okay? You look a little distracted. Everything good?
Okay. So I'm already feeling annoyed, totally distracted that he went to my boss. Yep. So definitely some boundaries being crossed. Anyone else, how are we feeling if this is the first minute that we've had with the salesperson? For most of us, it did not feel good. This was really problematic. I'm seeing shut out, ramrodded, pressured, push. Now, here's an important question for you. Yep, Rob, you're saying he's presuming too much. Here's a question. How much attention did you actually pay to the numbers that he was sharing? Because in addition to whatever else was happening, there was some really important rational data coming through that presumably matters when you're making your sales decisions. So were you listening to those numbers, or were you not even paying that much attention to them? Colette is saying in the Q&A, didn't hear the numbers, stopped listening. Ooh, that is a key 2 words right there. Stopped listening. Because this is a really important point to keep in mind. When we hear the term amygdala hijack, we might think of someone who's freaking out or who's completely shutting down. But the reality is, a lot of the time in a business setting, when our amygdala is triggered, it's not full hijack. We are in protect mode, but we might still be smiling and nodding. The people on the other side of that conversation might not even realize that we're feeling threatened. But we don't have to be in full freak out mode in order for our brain to go into self-protect. And what happens as a result of that is that, remember those studies about how the brain is and isn't lighting up. When the amygdala lights up, there is a lot less activity in the prefrontal cortex. There's actually less blood flow to that part of the brain because when we're in fight or flight, the body assumes that we need that extra blood flow to the muscles to protect ourselves. So what does this mean for you? It means that, let's say you're trying to make a really rational argument that should be incredibly persuasive in someone's interest. But if that person does not trust you, if they are in self-protect mode, you could make the best rational argument in the world, and they would either not fully process it or not hear it at all. So in order to operate at our best, rationally, logically, and in order to be able to get people to listen in a way that they can actually take in, let alone try to persuade someone of something, it is essential that it comes from that foundation of trust. Now, with that said, at this point, sometimes people will ask, okay, so I get into conversations all the time where I'm not a pushy salesperson, I'm not doing anyone's performance review, so no one's at risk of getting fired, and yet I feel a level of distress there. So what's going on in those cases when there's not an obvious threat? To answer this question, I want to show you a picture of a baby giraffe. For anyone who's ever watched a YouTube video of a giraffe being born, you're going to know what I'm talking about. And if you haven't seen one, it's adorable. You absolutely should. So when a giraffe is born, boop, it comes out. It's kind of wobbling a little bit, getting up on its shaky legs, trying to trot over to its mom, and it is so cute. However, let's contrast that to what happens when you have a human baby that is born. When we are initially born, we are not able to wobble over to our moms. We are incredibly incapable in those first few months of doing almost anything for ourselves except getting the attention of a larger human who can feed us, who can comfort us, who can take care of us. And as a result of this, all humans are born with a fundamental truth ingrained into their brains, and that is this: we need other humans for survival, and rejection equals death. Dramatic but true. And not just for babies. If you think about it from the evolutionary standpoint, think about those cave people 200,000 years ago. If you were rejected from your tribe, you're out there all alone against that saber-toothed tiger. And suddenly your chances of survival are much, much lower. This is something that is fundamentally programmed into our brains. So there are two key takeaways from this. The first of which is if you have ever had the experience where maybe you didn't get invited to a happy hour, or there's some event you were hoping to get an invitation to and you didn't, and you're feeling really bad about it, and then you kind of start beating yourself up. You're like, come on, I'm a grown up. Why do I feel so bad about this? The answer is because you're programmed to. So don't beat yourself up. It is completely natural for us to take rejection extremely personally. But the second point that pertains to trust building is this. Sometimes we can create moments for others that feel like micro rejections that are going to trigger that fight or flight response. Not at a massive level, but enough for people to go into self-protect mode and for trust to not be happening. And it happens in those little moments when we don't feel like we're listened to. We don't feel like someone at a meeting cares about the idea that we're trying to push forward. There are lots of little ways that we can feel rejected by others that are going to have an impact on our ability to build that trust. And in order to make sure that we connect with people and put our ideas forward, that trust and making sure it's built or rebuilt if inadvertently taken away is going to be essential. Now, with that in mind, we've talked about some of the things that can go wrong here. So what I want to give you is some of the techniques that you can use in order to build trust. I have run a lot of workshops like this, and in some cases, I work intensely with teams and go pretty deep. In addition to doing exercises on this, we will actually sometimes do audits. What are the trust levels in a given team? How are people triggered into distrust? Or what are some of the trust triggers within specific groups that can be really helpful for people to be aware of? But the good news is that even when we have a shorter session like today, there is enough research that there are specific small action steps that you can take that are already going to turn the dial. And if you apply them, even if it's a little change, it is very, very likely to improve to better trust. So let's look at what those are. The first technique that we're going to talk about is priming for trust. Now, what does priming for trust look like? First of all, it can be as simple as resetting your mindset and taking a breath before your next conversation. And here, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. Perhaps you've been at that office in a meeting where you've got a colleague for whom this is meeting number 5. They've been going meeting to meeting to meeting all day. In meeting number 4, something really annoying happened. And so now they come to your meeting and they're scowling. Now, you know, maybe you were in meeting number 4, you know that they're annoyed about whatever was back there. But chances are there's someone else in this conference room who's going to see that scowl and assume that it pertains to them or to the topic that you're going to be discussing. And so inadvertently, this colleague just created more distrust simply by not resetting. Next, you want to be open and trusting with your partner, because what research shows is that when we show up with that attitude of openness and trust, that lays the groundwork to make it much more likely that they are going to trust you in return. And finally, focus on shared success. That means that right before you're about to go into a conversation, just take that moment to set that intention of coming out of it where both of you are in a good place, whether it's because you're focusing on finding a shared solution that works for everyone, or very simply, you're focusing on making sure both of you enjoy the conversation. But taking that extra second to set that intention lays a really important foundation. However, in addition to this, there's another really important reason why priming for trust is important. And that has to do with this. When we don't prime for trust, we are much more likely to leap up what we refer to as the ladder of conclusions. What does that mean? That means that sometimes we have one fact or piece of information. So-and-so showed up late to the meeting. But then we start to add our own interpretation as to why that happened, make some assumptions, add some of our biases. And the next thing you know, you're coming up with a conclusion that's not necessarily true. Maybe you're making up a story in your mind. Oh, they don't respect me. This is, unacceptable. When in reality, you don't know what the story is. But when we don't preset to prime for trust, sometimes those biases leap in and we go up the ladder of conclusions. So I want to show you a brief video about what that might look like.
Imagine this. Your project meeting should have started 5 minutes ago, and Sam still isn't here. It's the third time this has happened. Your colleagues insist Sam is reliable, but today Sam rushes in at 10:07 looking distracted and barely engages with your update. So your mind starts filling in the gaps. Does Sam not respect me? Is he this unprofessional only with me? This is your brain in protect mode. When frustration kicks in, cortisol spikes, and this takes you straight up the ladder of conclusions. It starts with what we see, Sam is late, then we add meaning, he doesn't care about this project, then assumptions, he doesn't value my time. And soon that story shapes your tone, your reactions, and even the relationship. But what if the real story is something else entirely? One day, a note falls out of Sam's bag. Mom's appointment, 9:30. You realize he's been juggling medical emergencies while trying to hold everything together. Instantly, your perspective shifts, and so does your brain chemistry. Here's the interesting part. Your brain reacts to the story you tell yourself even without the full picture. So the next time you feel frustrated, pause and ask, what's another story that could also be true? One that keeps me open and curious? Sometimes choosing a different story changes the entire conversation.
Two really important points that I hope you take away from this video. One is that point about the stories we tell ourselves. Our brains have that tendency to create stories in our own minds, to fill in the gaps. But knowing that you're likely to create a story, and you probably don't have all of the information, why not create a positive one? Why not create one that makes you feel better and that's going to lead to better interactions, that assumes positive intent? And part of why this is so important is something that we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail in a couple minutes. But what happens based on these stories that we're telling us, based on these thoughts that we're having, is that these thoughts can actually change our neurochemistry. The way that we're taking in information can change our reality, not just on an emotional, but on a neurochemical level. So we'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. But for now, let's move on to our next tip. So, technique number 2. Here we go. Technique number 2 is to be transparent. Now, here's what's really interesting about this one. Studies show that being transparent is not only a net plus for our conversations in terms of building trust, because one piece of research that was done is that when we're transparent with our hands, when our conversation partners can occasionally see our open palms, that actually generates more trust than if the person constantly has their hands behind their back or otherwise hidden. So transparency is not just about conversations, but here we're going to talk about it in the conversational context. So a couple points around this. First, share your intentions and the reasons behind your actions. This kind of transparency is going to help you in any situation, but especially here where we have a lot of people who are operating in a multinational, cross-cultural context. This is going to be even more important. It's as simple as making sure people understand what your goals are, what your reasoning is, so that they're not guessing, so that they're not creating any stories in their mind, so that you're able to make it really clear for them and therefore make it feel safe. Next point around this is committing to truth-telling yourself and also understanding their truth. When you can create that environment where people openly express their perspectives, their lived reality, that's going to help to lower a lot of those barriers. And finally, test assumptions. Pause and verify. Do you have the same interpretation of either what's happened in the past or what's happening right now in this conversation? Once again, extra important when we're talking about a cross-cultural context. Now, this is where I do want to talk more about the neurochemical processes that happen. Because we've talked about what's happening in our brain when there is or isn't trust. But let's talk about the neurochemical reactions. Because the research shows what kind of neurochemical cocktails are released. If we are lacking trust, then first of all, that amygdala triggers the release of cortisol. It triggers some other things as well, but cortisol is a stress hormone. So it's going to result in us feeling defensive, worried, upset, rigid. And what's really important here is that we know from studies that this affects our thinking. When we have cortisol surging through our veins, we are in protect mode and we're a lot more likely to fall into tunnel vision. We're a lot less likely to see more of the opportunities and possibilities that are available to us. And as we've discovered already, we are not using our executive brain as effectively. On the flip side, when we feel trust, that also releases a number of neurochemicals. It releases oxytocin as well as dopamine. And the result of this is that we do feel upbeat, happy, positive, engaged, which is great. But also, very importantly, studies show that this helps us to be more creative, to have a more positive outlook, and to see more opportunities. And what is so important here is that understanding that a lot of the words that we're saying are going to influence our reality, not just emotionally, but on that neurochemical level. So with that in mind, let's talk about technique number 3. Ask questions for which you have no answers. This is a very specific tactic that I'm going to talk through, but I'm going to talk about why this is such an effective tactic. What are some examples of this? Be inquisitive and curious. Hopefully, there are things that are genuinely interesting to you about what the person you're talking about is experiencing or doing. And when someone is genuinely interested in us, we feel that. That makes us feel safer. Ask questions with the aim to share and co-create. When we're able to build on each other's ideas, that makes us much more open thinkers, and that creates a really good environment for more ideas to flourish. And double click on meaning. This goes back to the previous point about testing assumptions, but making sure that if someone is saying something or proposing something, you actually are hearing it and thinking about it from the same angle. Are there any underlying assumptions that you might not realize you have that are different? Now, again, posing it in terms of asking questions for which you have no answers gives you something very concrete to do. But why is this so important? It goes to one of the deepest elements of what you can do in order to build trust, which is to listen. Being a good listener and making people feel like they're heard is incredibly impactful. First of all, your conversation partner's guard is much more likely to go down when they feel that you're actually genuinely curious about them, that you really want to understand them. We make others feel safe by listening to them and making them feel heard, because that shows your reality is being taken into account. I'm not going to ignore it. And there's another linguistic element here, because when we listen, it makes it easier for us in our conversation to go from I language, meaning me, to we language, to talking in terms that include both of us or everyone in the group, which makes us feel included. It's the opposite of that rejection issue, and it helps to foster trust and openness. So making sure that you're listening is going to take you a really long way. And if you need a shortcut in the moment for how to help you do that, asking questions for which you have no answers is a really good, concrete way to start. So with this in mind, I've shared some techniques, and I want you to reflect. What's an upcoming conversation where using one of these is going to be helpful to you? And which one do you think is going to be especially relevant? If you'd like, I welcome you to add your answer into the chat or the Q&A. But regardless, let's take a pause to think. How can you apply one or more of these in a way that's going to help you in an upcoming conversation? As we're reflecting on these, and feel free also if you have any questions on any of these to add them to the Q&A. In a moment, I'm going to move on to a different aspect. So I see in the chat, pause more to show I'm listening. Yep. This is a really simple shift, but one can be very effective. Upcoming negotiation, being transparent and actively listening will be useful. Excellent. Ask more clarifying questions. Good. Yeah, these are all really simple things, but making sure that we think about how we can employ these is going to be incredibly helpful in terms of making sure that that trust is there and maintained or built. As a founder of a charitable nonprofit, building trust for donors to sponsor. Yes, yes, this is so important. And Melissa, I think that the next section we're going to go to is going to be very helpful for you in your building of trust with donors, especially when you want to ask for those donations. So let's move on to the next section. Here, I want to talk about the different levels of conversation that we engage in and how that can impact the way we're able to influence others. So these are levels of conversation we all use, but a lot of the time we're not as conscious of them. So I want to bring them forward in a way where you become aware of them so that now you can use them more strategically. First level of conversation, level 1, is transactional. This is the simple exchange of information. You tell someone something, you ask someone something. We're using it to inform, to confirm understanding, and this is a really good thing in many circumstances. You're exchanging information, you're validating what you already know. Now, the danger here where it can get misused is when we're trying to get information across and we feel like the other person is not taking it in, we can sometimes fall into what's known as tell, sell, yell syndrome. We tell them, feels like they're not taking it in the way we want them to, then we try to sell them on it, and then if things get really intense, we might even start yelling. A couple examples of what this looks like. I need the report done by Tuesday. Can your team complete it by then? Simple, straightforward, to the point. That's level 1. Now let's talk about level 2. Level 2 is positional. This is where you have an exchange of power. You're advocating, you're inquiring. And what that means is, on the one hand, you're trying to defend what you know. And on the other hand, this is where you might be trying to persuade the person you're speaking to. So, in its best form, this is where you're trying to influence others to agree with you because you think your idea is really great. You might be trying to look for a win-win solution. But where might this go awry? There's something known as addicted to being right, where we really want to sell our ideas and we want to be right. What's interesting is that studies show that dopamine, the neurochemical that makes us feel good, there's actually a dopamine release when we are right. And so sometimes we can really try to push for being right in circumstances that may or may not be as helpful. What does this look like in practice? It might look like saying, you see, this tighter deadline is going to help your team too. Or trying to find that win-win. Which of these incentives will motivate your team in order to meet this deadline? Now, after this, we can look at level 3, the transformational conversations where we share and discover. These are the ones where we discover what we don't know. These are the ones where we co-create. And at their best, this is about exploring, about holding space to find that uncharted territory, about listening to connect. This is where those questions that have no answers come in. On the flip side, potential downside is all talk and no action. If we get stuck in level 3, there might be a lot of ideas generated, but this is not where execution lives. If we actually need to get things done, that typically happens with level 1 and level 2 conversations. So, what might this sound like? Let's discuss this more and find the best solution for all of us. What are your initial thoughts on how we can work together? What is going to help your team? So nice open questions that are about generating ideas and co-creating. Now, what we know is that level 3 is the best level if our objective is to build trust. I'm not saying that you can't have trust in level 1 and 2, but if you know that trust is not where you need it to be, level 3 is the level of conversation that is going to help you to actually build it. And what's really important is this. When you look at the workplaces out there, I've worked with a lot of companies. If you're lucky, if you have a good company culture, if you have a great team, then chances are you're seeing all 3 of these types of conversations pretty regularly. But unfortunately, I also encounter some companies where the overwhelming majority of the conversations that are happening are level one and level two, which makes sense. Because again, if we're at work to get things done, that is typically where things get done. But remember the problem. If we're only staying in level one and level two, if we're not taking the time to have the kinds of conversations that build trust, we're not generating the best possible ideas. We're not generating the best levels of productivity. So not having level three in there is going to be a real potential problem. Now, let's look at an example of how this might appear in practice, specifically if you're trying to influence someone. So if, for example, Melissa is raising money for her charitable nonprofit, or let's imagine this. Let's imagine that you have gone to this workshop and later today you tell someone about it, and that contact of yours says, oh my gosh, that sounds really interesting. It sounds like something that my team absolutely needs. And so you connect me with your contact. We schedule a conversation. How might that conversation go? Well, on the one hand, every conversation is its own special snowflake. But on the other hand, I might be thinking about it from roughly the following angle. I want to make sure that we have both discovery and co-creation, as well as potentially a solution, if it makes sense. But here's how I might be tackling it. When I get on the call with your contact, I'm meeting them initially for the first time. I want to make sure that I'm starting in level three for two reasons. First of all, we don't know each other yet. It's important for us to build that rapport, to get into a place where we feel comfortable being open. And that's only going to happen through level three, not through me telling them something or asking questions with a clear agenda. And then when we're building that rapport, I'm genuinely curious to understand their reality, their world, to know more about their team. I want to have a sense of what's going on with them. So I'm asking level three questions, open questions for which there are no answers. And by the way, before I jumped on that call, I made sure to prime for trust. I made sure to take that little moment and think about, hey, regardless of how this conversation goes, whether this is a good match or not, I want to make sure we both enjoy it. And that mind shift, even a tiny one, is hopefully going to help this conversation flow better. Ideally, we are having a good level three conversation where we're exchanging ideas, maybe even co-creating. They share something. I'm like, hey, how would that look like if you did ABC? And they're like, oh yeah, actually XYZ would happen. And so we're building on each other's ideas and probably having a pretty good exchange. Ideally, I'd want to stay in level three for a good while. Now, let's imagine that this has gone well. There's been a lot of exchange, and it seems like a workshop on conversational intelligence could actually benefit this individual. So now I might be shifting into level two. Now remember, level two is the one where you are positioning, where I'm asking questions no longer because I'm open and curious and I want to co-create and discover, but because I have an agenda. I'm seeing if this fits into my ideas. So if I were to start with a lot of level two questions, that might not be great for trust. But in this instance, first of all, I've already built that foundation of level three conversation where we're having that great exchange and trust is high. And second, I'm going to use one of those techniques we talked about. So as I move into level two, I'm going to be transparent. I'll say something like, hey, I have a couple ideas for potential solutions, but I want to verify a couple details first. Does that work? So with that, the already established trust and me being transparent about why I'm asking these questions with an agenda, chances are very high that the answer is going to be a genuine yes. And so even though these are now positional questions with an agenda, I'm confirming things to see if the solution I have in mind works, it's still going to have a high level of trust. Now, let's imagine that I've asked a few more questions. And here I move on to level one. I'm going to share my idea. I'm going to say something like, listen, what I think would really help your team is this. Bam, bam, bam. I am telling them. But if everything that came before that level one helped to build trust and was a positive exchange, then your contact is likely to be very open and accepting to it. Even if they don't end up liking the solution or agreeing with it, they're going to be very open to that moment of when I switch into level one and simply tell them what I think they should do. But as you can see, the order here is extremely important because if I start a conversation like that right away at level 2, it's going to feel too salesy. Level 1, that's flat up really pushy. Who am I to be telling them something when I don't know anything and we haven't built any trust? But when you position this in an order that feels good to both of you and that builds trust, then that neurochemical process is much more likely to support a really powerful conversation. So with this in mind, flashing these 3 levels on screen again, let's take a moment and think. How might you apply this knowledge of the 3 levels of conversation in your own conversations, in something that you have coming up? Reflect on it, and if you'd like, feel free to share in the chat. Approaching delicate combos with my partner. Yes, I'm talking about this in a very business-oriented way, but the reality is all of this completely applies in all areas of life, including personal, family, friends. So absolutely, very applicable. Ooh, Rob says problem-solving solutions with other departments. Yes. And depending on your company culture, on the specific people involved, this is an area where sometimes there can be a lot of assumptions or there can be some conflicting interests. And I've seen places where there have been complications where trust is really eroded. And some of these tools can really help to re-level set, to get things into, if not an immediate trust space, into a better space. Because a lot of this is about dials. You're not going to go straight from distrust to trust, but if you can crank that dial to improve things a little bit in this conversation and more in this conversation, then that's going to make a big impact. With this in mind, I'm going to move on in a moment to Q&A. So if you have questions, please add them to the Q&A box. But I want to leave you with this, which is I'd love to connect. This was only a tiny, tiny amount of information on the broader topic of conversational intelligence, the science of building trust. So if you have questions, more than happy to go into more detail now, but also later by email. And I welcome you to connect with me on LinkedIn. I am always happy to connect and exchange ideas there as well. With that said, I'm going to look into the Q&A box. So Marie-Dominique, you said, can you explain more about the ladder of conclusions? Absolutely. Let me give you this example. And then if you have more questions, please let me know if this doesn't feel like it's fully answering it. In a lot of cases, and this is something that is more likely to happen when we might be coming in with a less trusting mindset. But what can happen is that if we're already not primed for trust, something happens and we can make assumptions and add our biases that add to a whole story that we're telling ourselves. So maybe let me give you a different example. Let's imagine that you are driving down the highway and suddenly someone cuts in front of you in a really dangerous way. And for most of us, that's danger. So it immediately activates our fight or flight response. And we are very likely to create a story in my mind. That person is so careless. They're such a jerk. Can't they see how much danger they're putting people in with their driving? But then what happens if, let's say, you find out later that that person was a mother who was driving a child who was bleeding profusely to the hospital? So on the one hand, she's trying to navigate the highway. She's trying to comfort the kid in the back who's crying. And that was why she cut in front of you and was driving that dangerously. With that new story in your mind, chances are all of that anger might very quickly shift into empathy. Oh my gosh, that's so rough. So all of those stress hormones are much more likely to go away and be replaced with a very different feeling. Now, what's important about this is not just the fact that we don't know what's going on, it's that we can actually create that story for ourselves. If we can try to train ourselves when something annoying like that happens, to fill in the blank with something that gives the benefit of the doubt, right? Because maybe you're driving down the highway, someone does that, and it is because they're a jerk. It is because they're careless. But if you tell yourself, you know what, maybe they're having an emergency. Maybe this is a really horrible day for them. Neurochemically, by telling yourself that, you're a lot more likely to feel calm and good where having that fight or flight response with that cortisol, those stress hormones, that's not actually going to help you. So the ladder of conclusions is essentially how do you avoid climbing it? And instead, how do you rewrite those mental stories when you feel yourself tempted to go in that direction? All right. Any other questions? Marie-Dominique says, great, thank you, you're welcome. Anything else from anyone else? All right, if there are no other questions at this time, again, I welcome you to connect with me. Feel free to add more questions or to reach out to me directly, and I'm happy to troubleshoot if you have any kind of situation or if you're curious to learn anything else about any part of this topic. And with that, I will hand it back to Anna.
This has been a very insightful and informative exchange. Thank you so much to Lydia Arshavsky for taking the time to share her knowledge and expertise with our audience. Really appreciate it. And to our attendees, if you're interested in learning more about joining the FACC network, please reach out to membership@FACC-NYC.org. You can also check out our website. And we encourage you to visit our portal for upcoming events. Thank you all and have a great afternoon.